Every one of those shells is an artifact collected by native people. You can see beautiful pit features in the middle of the photo. There's a nice little trash pit. That's probably filled with amazing artifacts and interesting things. You can see another trash pit on the right side there with a beautiful deposit there. Each of those trash pits probably represent a year at the most of time in native prehistory, a beautiful feature. I guarantee you every single one of these artifacts have washed out into the ocean since this photo was taken. So that's the reality that we're facing. This is unique, irreplaceable data that we're losing into the ground, and native people are losing their heritage as well.
So we are so glad to have with us today city archaeologist Joe Bagley to share his insights on the critical topic of climate change and its impacts on archaeological resources. He specializes in both Native American and historical archaeological analysis and the archaeology of Boston. In 2016, he was awarded the John L. Cotter Award from the Society for Historical Archaeology for early career achievements. Please join me in welcoming Joe Bagley.
We're going to talk about a bit of a sad topic, really, about the future of our past here in Boston. I'm going to really focus on the harbor islands themselves and the close shoreline area. And we're going to save all the questions till the end because I have a whole lot of stuff to get through today and we don't have a ton of time. So we have sometimes a bit of a doom and gloom view of what the future of climate change and sea level rise could look like in Boston. And I thought that this illustration was a little bit over the top, but perhaps endemic of what some people feel is a reality. This would be more likely if a meteor struck the harbor islands than if a storm came. However, the reality of what the sea level rise and storm surges will do for Boston really kind of was driven home in January a few years ago when the bombogenesis struck and most of the area around the Aquarium Tea Station, Long Wharf, and that area was completely flooded with near frozen salt water and icebergs. So the reality is that this is not something that is going to happen. This is something that is happening and will only get worse from here. So my approach to this as the city archaeologist is to look at the problem of what are we going to see here in Boston at the shoreline in areas that had previously been shoreline or even underwater, and places that we've never even looked before. What do we do in places where we don't know what's there and we're going to lose it before we actually have a chance to find it? So this is a quick example. I'll come back to this photo in a little while of what the threat is out in the harbor islands. This is a photo of Lovell's Island, and you can actually see at the top, the site is falling off the cliff. Whatever's up there could be 4 days old, it could be 4,000 years old. Everything in this photograph, I believe this photograph is now several years old, so most of that is not there anymore. And whatever archaeological data was at that cliff edge has been lost. You can see historic concrete structures down here, an old wharf that has since been lost, and then kind of the ruins of older structures on the outside. I don't know what all these structures are. We're not going to go into any real detailed specifics about what specific sites are, but I wanted to just kind of show this as an example of what's ongoing in the islands today. And the real reality or the real threat to me as an archaeologist and to the archaeology of these sites isn't necessarily the inundation that comes from sea level rise, which is a major problem. It's actually the storm surge and the erosion that happens, because as even though sea level rise is rapidly increasing in rate, the storms that are happening now are the things that are going to be eroding the sites vertically from the site, from these different islands. That's really the risk that I'm going to be discussing today. So we've done a lot of modeling in the city of Boston with many contractors and different groups, and this is a fairly disastrous projection of what the combination of sea level rise in Boston in 2100 coupled with a major storm surge would result in the flooding of Boston. And so there's areas such as Back Bay, which may be better protected by the dam system in the Charles. But the reality is we are going to lose some of the lowest possible areas in Boston, which are really the areas that have been recently created, mostly in the South Boston area. The historic waterfront of Boston and the East Boston area are exceptionally at risk to inundation. But this isn't necessarily going to destroy archaeological sites when this happens, because it's a fairly gradual process. And it's not a very active erosional process. So in order to talk about history, we really have to kind of go back to the beginning. So we're gonna rewind about 15,000 years real fast and talk about sea level change. So in the earliest part of our native history, which is really where the history of Boston starts, about 14,000 years ago, what we have is a rapid increase in sea level rise. And so that's actually what this chart is showing, is the depth of the ocean, or sorry, the rate of increase of the ocean going back to the end of the Ice Age. And this is the meters of change. So what this is saying is that at the Paleo-Indian period, which is about 14,000 years ago, when people first show up in Boston, the level of the water was 100 meters lower than it is today. And I'll show a map of what that would look like if we lost 100 meters of water. And this rapid blue level that you see in the increase on the left is the act of the actual glacier that was sitting on top of the United States, the Laurentide Ice Sheet, melting, and all of that water being dumped into the oceans and rapidly increasing the depth of the oceans over that time. And then around 8,000 years ago, the climate starts to stabilize. It doesn't fully stabilize, but it stabilizes enough to allow the oceans to creep up rather than rapidly flood the area around us. But we're still talking about halfway back in history. So we're going to zoom in on that last little section. Here we are coming up from the glacial maximum, and then we're leveling out, and there's a really important thing that happens 3,000 years ago, and that's when the water reaches the eastern edge of the harbor. And at that point, you have to imagine that the Boston Harbor looks kind of like a flat plate, where the rim kind of goes up to the edge, and that's the outer harbor islands. And at about 3,000 years ago, the water reaches that rim. And almost overnight, like in his geological terms, so let's say about 100 to 1,000 years, we have the creation of Boston Harbor from what used to be land when the Boston Harbor floods. So up until 3,000 years ago, which is of the 14,000 years, fairly recently, we didn't have a harbor in Boston. It was just a hilly expanse, kind of like Newton, east of us. And then, of course, at the very end, it's not recorded in this map because of the scale, but we have another rapid increase. We have the Paleo-Indian sea level rise from melting glaciers, a stasis, a fairly modest stasis, and then a rapid increase again, now caused by human impact. So what did that look like? We have the Laurentide Ice Sheet sitting on top of Boston. About 4,000 feet of ice was on top of us, nearly a mile thick. That puts it about, I think it's about 10 times the height of the Hancock Tower, for reference. And we're in Shama, which is the original name for Boston. Near the edge of the ice sheet, the actual edge is Nantucket, Long Island, Martha's Vineyard. Those are all being formed by the edge of this glacier, where the soils are being deposited by the glacier. So I made this animation to kind of give you an idea of what the harbor would have actually looked like going back in time. So this is today. I think we're going to go backwards or forwards. I can't remember how this goes. We'll find out together. Play. There we go. All right, so now we're back to 1630. So we filled in a lot of land in Boston. 3,000 years ago, we have the formation of Boston Harbor really taking off. 6,000 years ago, you can walk on dry land all the way out to the Boston Harbor Lighthouse. 9,000 years ago, the ocean is way out into the harbor. And so what you end up having is what we call the Paleo River. So you have the Paleo Charles River here, and a completely extinct river that I call the Paleo Wessagusset, which is the original name for Weymouth, that comes out to the southern part of the harbor that's now been completely drowned by the ocean. It doesn't really exist anymore. And the realities are the future in Boston, with the next slide that's coming up, with the sea level rise, we're basically going back to the original shoreline with sea level rise. And why am I talking about that? It's because all of that landscape in the harbor are places where native people have been for thousands of years, and archaeological sites, some of possibly the most important archaeological sites, may actually be in the bottom of the harbor because that's where people had lived in the past. This photo actually shows what it would have looked like at the absolute beginning of his history in Boston when native people are first coming into Boston. On the left shows all of Massachusetts Bay and Stellwagen Bank, which is a fairly shallow area towards the edge of the glacier. Everything in green on this map would have been dry land when native people first showed up into Boston. So an extremely different landscape that native people experienced in Boston. Boston was not a coastal town. It was just a river system about 100 miles from the shore when native people first came. And that's why you hear about people dredging for flounder and mussels, scallops out of Stellwagen Bank coming up with mastodon bones. That's because they were walking around out there with native people hunting them out at Stellwagen Bank when the water was that low. So why do we need to talk about history as far as time period and who's here? The reality is that native people are part of Boston's history. This map or this timeline shows the beginning of history when people show up and we have not just animals but humans, and 1630. And the reality is if you had a 100-foot long timeline, 1630 would start at the last 3 feet of a 100-foot timeline of Boston's history. So the majority of the story of the past here in Boston is the native history. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. So what have we actually found so far? One of the most important discoveries in the history of the North American archaeology was the discovery of the fish weirs about 100 years ago in Back Bay. So these are structures that were created by people along the shoreline. This is a Canadian one where these things are still being used. They're essentially fishing fences, and the way they would function is you would build them in an area where you have fish traveling, and at high tide, the water would completely submerge the fence and the fish would swim over top of it. At low tide, they'd come back down from having spawned, usually in the spring during the herring and alewife run, and they would get caught by the fence, and the native people would be there to collect them by the thousands. I have a little bit of an animation coming up. During the building of the subway tunnel down Boylston Street in 1913 and 1914, archaeologists were on site because they discovered a bunch of sticks in the mud. And that's kind of one of the phrases for them, is a bunch of sticks in the mud. These fish weirs were placed there by native people going back thousands of years, about 3,000 to 5,000 years to be specific, to create these fish weirs across Back Bay. And I'll talk about how they're found in depth-wise. The photo on the right, I know these are not the best quality photos, I apologize for that. But what this shows is the construction of 500 Boylston Street, which is the large office building with the central arch next to the Prudential and Hancock building. When that was being built in 1985, you can actually see the 2 main layers of deposit. You've got the Back Bay fill, which was put there in the 19th century in order to create Back Bay. You have the natural silting of Back Bay by the Charles River, and then right around this level, it's a little bit easier to see in the original, you can actually see the sticks coming out of the mud from about 3,000 years, 6,000 years ago, where they were placed. And since that time period, the Charles River has deposited about 13 feet of mud on top of them, but that mud has encased them and preserves them indefinitely. So these are the kind of things that we need to look for on the shoreline of Boston, because these things are being built by native people, and they could also be lost to erosion as they're being, because they're really well preserved under silt. So I made another animation to kind of show how it worked. You have the glacier depositing a glacial blue clay, the Boston blue clay, and over time the Charles River develops sediments. The river comes along and starts rising up and down twice a day. Native people come out and they build the fish weirs across the Back Bay area at low tide. That's important. And in the spring, you have the herring run, and all the fish go up the river at high tide. They go up and spawn in Watertown in that area. They turn around at low tide. They go, what the heck? There's a fence here. They get stuck behind it. And the native people come out into their canoes and gather the fish and then dry them on Boston Common, which is nearby. It's a genius construction that these native people figured out how to make. And then we have 18 feet of silt, 20 feet of fill, and this is where they're found, approximately where the marathon finish line is. And then we dig it down in 1913 to build the tunnel, and that's where we first see them. And then the tunnel comes along, and that's the story of the fish weirs in animation form. But the reality is they're one of the largest man-made structures in North America in history. And it's here in Boston, and very few people know about it. And they're about 3,000 to 6,000 years old. They're also one of the first things ever carbon dated. The guy that worked on this project in the early teens and 40s was based out of Andover Museum of Archaeology and at the Peabody Andover Museum. And he invented carbon-14 dating. So he was kind of the ideal person to do it, and he was the one that figured out the date. So, Harbor Islands. We're going to move over to the islands for a little bit and talk about some of the resources that are out there. What do we think about for Harbor Islands archaeology? From the native perspective, what I think a lot about is shell middens. These are extremely visible and extremely fragile archaeological deposits, and they're actually really easy to see because basically what happens is you have a deposit of organic material, and that's what we call the midden. You can have an historic midden. I make a midden in my backyard if I leave some food out. It's an organic deposit that composts and makes a black soil. Shell middens are that soil plus shells. We're not very creative people, archaeologists, as far as our naming goes. Most of them were formed about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, up to about 400 years ago. And the reason why we know that is, one, we can date some of the artifacts found in these shell middens to help date them. But the other thing is that the sea level was changing so rapidly that it took until about 2,000 years or so ago for the levels of the ocean to stabilize enough that we could actually have the development of large clam beds in the harbor. So without that stability of the ocean, the clams want to be at a certain depth. And if the ocean's constantly rising or constantly shrinking, going down, the clams move around and they don't have that chance to build the large clam beds. So it wasn't until about 1,000 to 2,000 years ago that we had enough clams established in the harbor to actually allow people to eat them in any huge quantity that didn't just wipe them out. And so that's where you have this explosion of shell middens all around the coast. Now, you wouldn't go very far from the shoreline to eat a clam. They're not exactly very easy to keep fresh. And so what ends up happening is these things are being formed on the shorelines all around the harbor islands. And now that erosion's taking over, we're starting to lose them because they're the first things that fall into the ocean. So this photograph was actually taken down at Martha's Vineyard. I don't have any photographs of the shell middens on Boston Harbor. There's a bunch though. And this photograph was taken when I was an undergrad at BU, so probably like 2005. Every one of those shells is an artifact collected by native people. You can see beautiful pit features in the middle of the photo. There's a nice little trash pit. That's probably filled with amazing artifacts and interesting things. You can see another trash pit on the right side there with a beautiful deposit there. Each of those trash pits probably represent a year at the most of time in native prehistory, a beautiful feature. I guarantee you every single one of these artifacts have washed out into the ocean since this photo was taken. So that's the reality that we're facing. This is unique, irreplaceable data that we're losing into the ground, and native people are losing their heritage as well. Spectacle Island. I know we have some descendants from Spectacle Island. I want to talk a little bit about the archaeology there specifically. There's a really nice shell midden that was found there in the late 80s and early 90s and excavated ahead of the oncoming wave of fill that was being brought to Spectacle Island in order to cover it up. So this is a photograph of the archaeology in action on the Spectacle Island. A large shell midden was found, but they only were able to sample 100 units, which is a 1 meter square. So a very small sample of the site was taken before it was left and moved, and the archaeologists had to move on. So there's quite a bit of this shell midden underneath that capping fill on Spectacle Island. And one last example of a really interesting site on the edge of Charlestown. Here's the USS Constitution as a reference. Paul Revere Park and City Square Park is in the upper left corner. We're kind of looking essentially southwest. And in that star point, that was originally part of the shoreline. And I like to call it the Chickenfoot. There's this three-pronged bay that just went up inside of Charlestown. You can see it in the middle of the photo there, and I have it again on the left side. What that was a natural inlet that formed thousands of years ago from the melting glacier. And then that was used by the early colonists in the 1630s in order to build their town dock. So town dock in Boston is now Faneuil Hall. Town dock in Charlestown was this Chickenfoot. And it was built in 1630. It's a really important part of Charlestown history. And when the archaeologists went there to dig there during the Big Dig, this is now the tunnel that you pop through in order to get to Tobin Bridge. This is where the site went right through the middle of. What they were able to find around the edge of the actual pier itself was this semi-submerged site. So here on the left, you see this kind of gridded system. That's actually the timbers of the town dock wharfs themselves from 1630. And then you have this kind of, tailings that come off the edge of it. What those actually are fairly large logs that are being placed at the base of this wharf, and it's a little bit hard to see depth from here. So I've got an example of another example of this feature. So this is not Boston, the next photo, but this is essentially what they found. And archaeologists call these, well, everybody calls these, corduroy roads. And I can barely say that word, but corduroy roads are wooden roads that are created in areas that are constantly moist. So things like bogs. In this case, they were created around the town dock so that at low tide, this exposed mud at the bottom of the dock, of the pier, would be covered in these wooden logs, and you could walk around the base of the dock and repair the dock and be able to collect things that may have fallen into the dock without getting stuck in the mud, literally. So archaeologists recovered those in this kind of tailings of the edge of Charlestown. And then what they did is on a whim, they actually put a shovel test pit through the mud that that road was actually on top of, and found this black layer where I have this marked as 13800 AD. That was carbon dated. It was a peat bog that was forming on the edge of Charlestown. Directly underneath that, they found more soils, and in those soils were native artifacts. And so that was a bit of a challenge for how to interpret that. And what they were able to determine was that 3,000 years ago, so 1000 BC, Charlestown was further from the shoreline than it is today. So what we had was a native settlement on the edge of Charlestown that became completely submerged by the rising sea levels to the point where an actual marsh formed on top of the native site that was 3,000 years old. And so the shoreline of Charlestown moved over. And what this is really showing us is that, this is an artifact that was found. So the artifact's on the left. It's a terrible photograph, and I apologize for that. But it's called a scraper, and this is how it would have looked if it was hafted into a handle. So it would have been used for hide scraping, woodworking, gourd cleaning out, things like that. Basically, it's a scraping tool. And that was found in that site as well. And this would be approximately where the site would be located 3,000 years ago. So you can see the shoreline is not moving very far in that part of Charlestown, but it's far enough away that you have a native site that's now completely underwater. At least it was before we filled in that part of Charlestown. Approximation of what this community would have looked like based on the Pequot Museum in Connecticut. If you haven't been there to see their full-scale reproductions of native communities, please go see it. It's really pretty impressive. That's the edge of Charlestown. And this is what it would have looked like in 1300 AD after the sea level rose up. So what this means is that we have a combination of eroding sites where the sites are falling off the edges of cliffs, but we have really strong examples in Charlestown from the Big Dig where the subtle rise of sea level, it's not subtle in the sense that we're all going to really suffer from it, but from an archaeological perspective, it's a fairly subtle rise that allows us to have these formations of protective layers of marsh grass and things like that actually will leave these sites intact, which means that there's a strong possibility that those native sites that exist in the harbor at the bottom of the seafloor are still there, at least in some places. And they would be fairly old. Other historic resources, I hope the images are visible on this. This is at the very eastern edge of the of Logan Airport, and you can just see that little smudge along the shore of the former Governor's Island. And this is an aerial photograph. You can check it out today when you go back. Look at the eastern edge of Logan Airport. There's a 250-foot long shipwreck sitting outside of Logan Airport. You can't go to it because everybody from NSA will show up and Homeland Security if you get anywhere near that edge of the airport. So I feel totally fine showing everybody where this thing is because you really can't get to it. Basically, what it is, I talked to the state underwater archaeologist who told me that Governor's Island, towards the end of its history, became a place to salvage ships. So they would actually bring old boats to Governor's Island and take them apart and keep whatever they could. And this is one of the last boats that arrived to Governor's Island and is still there. So it's just sitting, it's a massive boat off the coast. And it's one of our many shipwrecks in Boston Harbor, some of which are much older than this one. This is a 19th century one, but we have 17th century shipwrecks in Boston Harbor that are preserved on top of those drowned landscapes from the deep past. And another shipwreck real fast, we filled in a lot of land. So we have plenty of places where we have boats that are sitting at the bottom of the ocean that are now in the middle of the Seaport District, like the Seaport Shipwreck that we found in 2015, 2016, a few years ago, in the middle of Seaport Boulevard. At about 30 feet down, we had a 65-foot deep, 65-foot long schooner carrying lime down from Maine from about 1860 that sunk after catching fire in Boston Harbor that we found during construction, and we called in for a 3-day emergency project. Really exciting project. We weren't able to salvage the whole ship, but I have a bunch of pieces of each type of timber at my lab for permanent curation. But the Seaport District, besides being one of the places most likely to flood again and go back to being the harbor, underneath all that fill is the original harbor, the original South Bay flats, where a lot of shipwrecks may actually be. So we have, because of this dig, because of this discovery, there's now rules in place for all of the seaport that any development that happens there has to have a contingency plan in place for what to do if they find a shipwreck. So even though this one was a surprise, the next one hopefully won't be. But I expect that there'll be a few left to find if there weren't a few that were lost during development already. Rainsford Island, my friend, although I don't take very good care of it. So this is Rainsford Island. I'm technically the manager of Rainsford Island. It's not the most logical or not the most easy thing to do to manage an island that I can't really get out to very easily. But I want to talk a little bit about the resources there because it being something entirely within my department's realm to look at and to manage, I have a lot of concerns about the resources out there as well. I want to point out a couple. This is the Piggery, which I believe is from about 1910 or so. This was not built on the edge of the shore when it was first built. It was built on an open field area. And over time, the shoreline has marched towards the Piggery and essentially eroded back that shoreline to the point where half of the site is now almost in the water at high tide, and at really high tides, it's underwater. This is not the most significant historic resource in the Harbor Islands by any stretch of the imagination. It's a pig pen, literally, but it's a really good bellwether for what the erosion is causing to the edge of the shorelines and an actual very visible site that is on the edge, literally, and at risk. But the one I'm much more concerned about is this area, which you can see on any historic maps. I know some of you know what this is. What is this area on the southern bit of Rainsford? Yeah, it's a 2 to 3 acre graveyard. At a very high tide, this is underwater. So this is an area that the erosion on both the south and the northern side, you can see it creeping in there. This kind of lack of a strong edge there implies that you have sand and rocks being deposited on top of the plants that are growing there, and the plants eroding into the harbor. So the ocean is creeping up to the smallpox hospital graveyard, and there's a beautiful hedge of lilacs that are there, beautiful historic resource of a landscape resource. It was built there to help in many ways visually block off the cemetery, but also because the cemetery would have been active all winter as well. You had large mass burials, and then every spring when the lilacs would bloom, things would start to melt, and you can kind of use your imagination as to where things would go from there. The lilacs were there to cause a physical screen, but also a nose screen for the folks that were out on the islands, because the hospital was right there, the stone hospital. On the northern slope of the island, I'm sorry, everything's kind of backwards on this map. It's the best view of it. We have a really strong eroding cliff edge here. This is about 2 or 3 stories tall. I was really pleased when I went out there to look at the soils themselves. They're actually mostly clay, not sand, which is good for the cliff. It's going to be a little bit stronger than I thought it would be. It doesn't mean it's protected by any means, but this is an area of pretty strong erosion. And at the very top of that was where the site master's, the superintendent's house was on Rainsford Island that oversaw the schools and the hospitals that were on Rainsford in the 19th century. That's now currently a vacant hole in the ground for the cellar, but that's also a historic site and an archaeological site around that, and it's located feet now from the eroding edge, and for all I know it's less than feet now and possibly eroding into the harbor. I really need to get back out there to check on all of these. So what do we do about it? Because that's a really important part of this. The very first thing that we need to do is model and predict. So what does that mean? First of all, we need to know how the islands change. One of the things about the islands is that the changes in the harbor is not so dramatic that we're going to turn around and look back and all the islands have disappeared underwater. That's not how this works. The islands themselves are glacial deposits, they're hills. So they're quite a bit of ways above sea level. And the thing about an island is that you never have erosion on all sides. What you have is you have areas where some of the island is eroding and we're losing the island, and you'll have a corresponding other part of the island where stuff is being deposited. And you'll almost always have both of those things going on. What that means, and I have a little kind of evolution of Levels Island from a group of BU geologists from 2004, showing about 4,000 years ago when the harbor first formed, we had this little set of hills on the left, and then as the ocean kind of swirls around them, you have erosion causing the spits to grow between the islands and starting to connect the islands. And then from there, you have these kind of lagoons forming around the islands. And then as the islands begin to drown with the rising sea levels, you have this kind of area, the shadow around the island from where the island used to be, coupled with some of the islands that have essentially been lost, except for the rocks that are underneath them, and these formations of eroded and kind of shaped drumlins there, like the central drumlin, lagoons, and small hills. So these islands have constantly been changing, and they will continue to change. While the sea level rise will cause the islands themselves to get smaller, just because the islands will be further underwater, they will also change shape and move across the harbor. Not at a rapid pace, but that's something we need to pay attention to, is that you have a loss and gain on each of these islands. So this is a map of another island that is from an atoll, and it doesn't really matter where it is. I'm more showing the type of map. So this is an erosion and accumulation map. So what somebody's gone through in this atoll, where you can see there's tons of buildings, is looked at areas where the land is being lost and areas where the land is being gained because of all these buildings that are at risk. And so what you see on these green edges is areas where the island has actually grown from historic maps, and then these brown areas you can see where the island's actually being lost. In this case, this is a fairly minor erosion area, and most of the island is gaining soils over time. It's not going to be that way at the harbor islands. The nice thing about mapping erosion and accumulation at the harbor islands is it doesn't take a master's degree to do it. You walk out to the islands and you look. I have this Lovell's Island photo. This is erosion. We can all see that. Over here, you can see where the grass is actually coming down the slope and reaching closer to the shoreline. That's an area where there's less erosion. And that's how we map these things. It's really just a 2-highlighter system where we take the map of the island and we say this area, the shoreline is eroding, and this area, it's not. And the areas where it's eroding become the areas that we have to put all of our attention and resources into, because those are the areas where we're going to lose the sites at the top of the hills. Also, the top of the hills are where most people did all their activities, so those are also the best places to find sites. What else do we need to do? We need to involve the community. So there's numerous descendant communities in the harbor, many of whom are Native peoples. So the Massachusetts are the Boston-based tribe, the Nipmuc are the state-recognized tribe, and the Wampanoag are the federally recognized tribe here in Boston. We need to have Native input because it's their history that we're actually looking at in many of these cases. Their ancestors are the ones who left these things behind, and they need to have direct say in how these things are being dealt with, who deals with them, where artifacts go, what types of artifacts can be made public, which things can't, and also hopefully direct involvement by having Native people participate in the archaeology as well. That would have to come from some of these things. Another program that there's discussions about something like this starting up, but it's never really got traction yet. I'm hoping to change that in the next year or so. Florida does an amazing program called the Heritage Monitoring Scouts, or the HMS program. And basically what they do is they have records of where sites are known, and they essentially agree to empower members of the public who are specially trained and vetted to not go out there and loot the sites, to go and monitor the locations of these sites and keep track of where these things are being lost. So what it would mean is to have a map of the resources that we know, and that would include buildings like lighthouses, fishing camps, a fort, things like that, and then archaeological resources, which would most likely just be a highlighted area on the map saying there's a site here, because you can't really see it, and even landscape features like historic apple plantings, the lilac hedge that you saw in Rainsford. Going to those known locations after storms and photo documenting what the shoreline changes occurred because of the storm, and highlighting and bringing to attention for the managers of these places, like DCR, NPS, and the city, but mostly DCR and the city. What are the areas of greatest concern? Is this area gone from a slow area to a fast area? We need to now put a lot more resources in that area instead of someplace else. But the reality is we can't dig everywhere. So it's going to have to become a combination of known resources, strong potential for resources, and resources that are available to actually go out and dig, which is mostly money. How do you prioritize? This is a really complicated map, but basically we can put together what's called a sensitivity map, and that is a technical term that really just says we can look at the islands and the shoreline of Boston and go, this area has a site, therefore it's highly sensitive because we know there's something there. This area doesn't have a site, but it probably should have a site. We just haven't looked there before. So that becomes a highly sensitive area just for potential of an archaeological site. And then you might have other areas where there's probably nothing there because of various things, like maybe there was a mining operation that happened or some sort of dredging that occurred that we lost some land, and we don't really need to worry about those areas. And so it's a combination of figuring out where places are already known and the likelihood of there being additional stuff that we've never had a chance to check, because very few of the islands have ever been surveyed archaeologically. Probably the most surveyed island is Thompson's Island, because of the work of Barbara Ludtke at UMass Boston for years, had gone out there and done surveys out there and has really done a fantastic job of documenting those archaeological sites. But that's the island that's been looked at the most. And what that really means is that there's so many archaeological sites on Thompson's that it's kind of scary to think about how many haven't been found on the other islands just because we haven't looked. So that's where the sensitivity mapping comes from. And then what you have to do is put those two things together, and that becomes your punch list. What are the areas where we have known erosion coupled with known sites? Those become our highest priority places to do documentation and recovery. Then the next lowest are places where we have erosion and strong potential for sites, but we don't actually know where those are. And then the lowest, you get the picture. What does that actually look like? So for archaeology, for places where they haven't actually been dug yet, you have to do a dig. This is a photo of what a phase 1 looks like, which is really just going out to a site and determining, is there a site here, yes or no? And we dig a bunch of small test pits, either in a row or in a grid, and those test pits take a little sample of the site and to make a determination as to whether or not there's a site there. And if we have a place where there's a lot of erosion going on and we do these test bits and we don't find an archaeological site, whether it be native or historic, fantastic. Let's move all of our resources someplace else, because that's an area that we don't have to worry about the archaeology. If you dig it and you find a bunch of stuff, that's a problem. Now we have to put more resources into that spot to recover what we can before it ends up into the ocean. The other thing that we can do in the harbor is something called Sidescan Radar, which is actually taking a radar machine on a boat, putzing around the harbor for a while, and what it does is actually produce these amazingly high-tech, highly detailed maps of structures on the ground. So areas where we haven't dredged the harbor, haven't laid down 45 pipelines and things like that, we actually have the ability to find shipwrecks at the bottom of the harbor without getting wet. So that's the way to do these side scan. That's the way to look for submerged sites that are at the very surface of the bottom of the ocean. For buildings, the best thing that we have is something called Habs, Hare, and Howells, which is extremely complex and detailed professional drawings and records taken of historic American buildings is the Habs. E for Hare is engineering, and L is landscapes. And so those are the three categories that you can take. This is a Habs drawing of an historic building. I actually don't know where it's from. These drawings are essentially made to give us the most technical record of these buildings that we can create before they're gone. And in some cases, Hab drawings are done for places that are still around. I know there's a Habs drawing of this building, but they're also done as a way to mitigate a loss of a building, where you go in and essentially record everything you can about the way it was built. All the details in the moldings, these decorations in the carving would be carefully drawn precisely. In essence, you could rebuild the building based on a Habs documentation. It wouldn't be historic, but it could be similar in look. And then there's now laser scanning that's being done on a lot of these sites, which is a lot easier from a drawing point of view, and it works fantastically for landscape surveys where you're trying to capture acres in some cases of landscape, historic landscape that are either man-made or not, but are significant. And all of those are then archived at the Library of Congress indefinitely. So these are some of the responses. None of what I'm actually talking about today is how to stop the sea level and the erosion from happening. The reality is there's never going to be enough money in archaeology and historic preservation to stop the ocean. So this is all ways to mitigate the impact. If we're going to lose it, then what do we do? Unfortunately, that's the most financially viable option. We can't go out there and build seawalls around all the islands. That would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And do you put that resource into protecting an island, or do you put that resource into protecting people? And that's where it kind of boils down to. So with the historic resources, we have to document and record before they're gone, and accept that we're not going to be able to get everything. Funding, who's going to pay for all of it? So this is an important part. National Science Foundation has been interested in funding more climate-related things, although that changes by the administrations at the top. Another really great source of funding that I think would really help with this is the Community Preservation Act, both in Boston and other towns. As far as I'm aware, the only island that does not belong to a town that has Community Preservation Act funding is Deer Island, parts of Deer Island, 'cause some of it's owned by the state. Every single other island in all of the harbor belongs to a town that has CPA funding. Community Preservation Act funding is a surcharge that's added to your property taxes in whatever town that's been passed. It's a state ordinance. And that money goes towards historic preservation, low-income housing, and open space funding. And in Boston, there's been a very positive reaction to archaeology. We're going to be starting a project at Faneuil Hall. We're going to be opening up an archaeological lab in Faneuil Hall around January. You can actually come see the artifacts that were dug up there in the 90s be reprocessed. We're going to digitize all those artifacts, put them online, and then we're going to design a semi-permanent exhibit in Faneuil Hall that focuses on the role that Boston played in the North Atlantic slave trade. And we're going to go there. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to show how bad it was in Faneuil Hall. And that's been funded entirely by Community Preservation Act funding. And actually, this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about how CPA funding could potentially fund digs in Boston. So that's the next step, is to not just do collections work, but to actually use the funding to proactively dig up places that are at risk. And so that's a really good source of potential funding. Millions of dollars. I think we have about $20 million every year in the CPA, and it comes back every single year. A lot of that goes to housing and parks, as it should, but there's still a ton left over for historic preservation. And as this goes by year, there's going to be a lot of great things that come out of this funding. All right, so that's my one future hope, is that we can actually recover some of this data. But otherwise, I'd love to take some of your questions, and thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you. That was really very interesting. I'm wondering whether the dredging in the harbor right now is whether the material that's coming up, whether it's being looked at, or whether it has any potential, or whether there's just way too much of it to even cope with, or
I don't know the direct answer to that question, because I'm not sure exactly where it is. But that being said, the ocean floor is within the realm of jurisdiction for our state underwater archaeologist, who was Vic Mastone, but now it's Dave Robinson. Both are fantastic archaeologists. So what happens is, when something's going to impact the ocean floor or Boston Harbor floor, they have jurisdiction from, I think it's mean high tide. Is Dave here? No, mean high tide to a certain depth, and I don't remember the exact distance, but basically the harbor is in their jurisdiction. So all of those projects have to get reviewed by an underwater archaeologist who has the master files for where every known shipwreck is. The reality is, much of the dredging is happening in the same place as other dredgings have occurred already, and they're just silting back up. But I do know that besides dredging, there's things like laying of pipes from one island to the next, or stretching them across new areas. Those are all getting surveyed as well. And the reaction to those is to go out and do that Sidescan Radar to check to see if there's any resource sitting there. So this is ongoing now. Dave, who's now our state underwater archaeologist, he was the one that did the surveys between the Cape and the islands back in the day during the Cape Wind Project, and his work found that there was preserved native landscapes under the clay and the silt from the ocean, including things like intact trees and things like the tree bases, from that had drowned forests, essentially, that were in between the state and the islands. So essentially that would have been looked at. So there should be, by the time the dredging happens, someone has checked and made sure that there wasn't anything there. The absolute worst time to do archaeology is while the construction's happening. So all of these things are supposed to happen before. So usually if you see dredging, probably about 2 years ago, an archaeologist was reviewing that project. And if there was any work that was done, it happened the prior year. Yeah. Usually.
A number of years ago, up in, I think, the Rye Beach area in New Hampshire, some old cypress stumps were exposed during a very, very low tide, and I think it periodically happens. And these cypress trees are ancient. And I'm wondering how much you can predict astronomically when they're going to be very, very low tides, and whether there's sort of an opportunity there to do special things when you can astronomically predict a kind of moment of opportunity.
Yeah, I know that that's definitely something that people would take into account when it's ready to be documented. I don't know if there's any active documentation that's happening on that drowned forest. There's another one down on the South Shore. One of the challenges with drowned forests is that the trees are a little bit more resistant than the soils, and so what you tend to have is these trees without the sites around them, because the mud and the clay and everything has eroded around the tree stumps that are still there. That said, I know that when they do, I think it's Salem State or Bridgewater, one of the two state colleges on the east coast of Mass does a yearly underwater archaeology survey, and that tends to not be actually underwater, but kind of in that limbo land where it floods twice a day, and they actually will design the dig around the tide schedule and pick a time of the year where the tides are going to be their lowest so that they can actually get out there for the longest amount of time. So it's taken into account during surveys, but I don't think there's any active monitoring that's going on of that resource. I know it's recorded as an archaeological site because of the potential there, but I don't know specifically about Rye Beach. But that would the astronomical predictability is there, so it's something that is brought into a lot of these projects. Yeah.
Do you use that astronomical predictability in any of your work here in Boston Harbor?
I don't personally. I think the closest thing I come to that is realizing that there's a king tide coming, and if it's coupled with a storm, it's going to be pretty rough out there, literally, but also on the sites. So with all the nor'easters that come in, if it's coupled with a high tide, I just assume that we're losing archaeological sites out there. But as someone who's not able to just jump in a boat and run out there with a shovel and start recording, I can't. It's not something that is really taken into account in like my daily activities. I just kind of know it's out there, and it's one of those depressing things to think about every once in a while. But unfortunately, no, I'm not really incorporating that. I know that the underwater archaeologists are, though.
Along with the sea rise that is actually going to probably submerge and drown stuff, have your studies indicated whether there's actually a sinking of some of the land masses that might be there? I know on George's Island, we're looking at a corner of the fort that literally is having the blocks of granite just settle further and further down into the ground. And on a recent trip out there, I kept looking to see whether we had a missing chunk of seawall where water would be sneaking in to undermine it. And oddly enough, at the point I thought I should have seen a break in the seawall, it looked pretty good. So it then led to the question in my mind, are we actually having land masses settle because some of what's going on underneath is actually causing another form of submerging?
I don't know. I've never heard of that happening on the islands, per se. I guess in theory it's possible. One thing that I got asked before the talk that I can kind of talk a little bit about it is we're having a strange situation that's going on downtown. I just did a dig in Chinatown where we actually had a combination of the land mass of the fill is starting to settle down a little bit deeper than it had been because it's been there for about 100 years, so it's starting to sink down a little bit. Coupling with the slow rise of the fast now, but the rise of sea levels on the shore is actually pushing our groundwater further inland and further up. And so when we dug in Chinatown, we came down on the water table about 6 feet down, not expecting it to be that shallow, and our site hadn't even really started, so we had to leave because our site was starting to flood. But the reality was the land itself was sloping. We found the floor of a building, and the floor was almost a foot deep, shallow, or deeper in one end than the other. And that's happening because the land itself is starting to subside a little bit. And I think that's a combination of construction coupling with the actual land itself settling on top of the rotting pylons that are there. So all the filled land of Boston is being built on vertical, basically tree trunks that are stuck in the ground to hold up the buildings, and the fresh water needs to be kept at a certain depth to keep the tops of those buildings from rotting, or tops of those pylons from rotting, and as they rot, the buildings on top of them will sink into the land. And so we have a combination of the changes in the sea level affecting the changes in the freshwater levels of Boston that are resulting in subsiding of land as things are crushing down the fill, coupled with the crushing of the actual things holding up all the buildings. So it is happening. I know that's not really what you were asking about, but but it is sort of happening in that way inland because of sea level change, weirdly enough. Yeah.
Let's have a round of applause for Joe. Thank you.